Hello and welcome to the course introduction of Oracle 11G R2 Real Application Clusters Part 2. My name is Steve Hamilton and I'll be your instructor for this course. Okay, let's get started. This course is part 2 of a two-part series, and it will include the RAC components, nodes, diagnosing issues, RAC, as well as DataGuard. It will also include RAC as well as DataGuard Broker. We'll investigate the differences and uses within RAC as well as the DataGuard Broker, ASM, node management. Node management will include adding as well as removing nodes within the RAC environment. Also, how do you administer the RAC environment? We will look at AWR, which is Automatic Workload Repository, as well as ADDM, which is Automatic Database Diagnostic Monitor. And also, how to implement a RAC in a virtual environment using either VM Player or Oracle's VirtualBox or VM Server. Within this course, or the course objectives, will be to learn how to add and remove nodes within a RAC environment. To reduce the RAC components. So not only are we going to delete nodes, we will also learn how to remove the overall cluster software from a node that you wish to delete. When we talk about diagnosing RAC issues, we're going to look at the data dictionary views, your GV tables, the AWR, Automatic Workload Repository, the ADDM, Automatic Database Diagnostic Monitor. We will look at network interconnects, the VIP, as well as the SCAN, which is the Single Client Access Name, brand new in Oracle 11G R2. We will look at specific parameters as they pertain to the SP file. We will see where the SP file now resides in 11G R2 environment. We will look at the parameters that have to be unique across all nodes in a RAC environment, as well as those parameters that have to be different within a RAC environment. We will look at RAC as well as DataGuard configurations. DataGuard configurations will be dealing with a primary database, let's say located in Atlanta, and your secondary database located in Chicago. This is used for failover. In the event that you lose a data center in Atlanta, we can immediately fail over to that data center in Chicago. We will look at configuring DataGuard Broker with DataGuard. DataGuard Broker is the ability to perform automatic failover. Otherwise, if we do not have DataGuard Broker, we'd have to perform a manual failover, which may or may not result in data loss. RAC and ASM, these are very intertwined in an Oracle 11G R2 environment. In order to have 11G R2, you must have ASM, or the Grid Infrastructure Architecture, which is basically the same. Oracle's kind of renamed this in 11G R2 to the Grid Infrastructure Architecture. And we will learn how to configure RAC as well as ASM. And then we will look at configuring RAC in a virtualized environment. We will look at VM Player. We can also introduce things like VirtualBox as well as VM Server. But we can definitely look at how to configure RAC using virtualization. And then finally, we will remove the entire RAC from a node. So we'll start with a two-node RAC, and at the end of the day, we'll be down to a single instance environment. The prerequisites for this course will be Oracle Database Administration 1, Part 1 and 2, or equivalent experience. And then Oracle 11G R2 Real Applications Part 1. So we want you to complete the Oracle 11G R2 Part 1 before taking Part 2. Remember that Real Application Clusters is a registered trademark of the Oracle Corporation. The topics will include server control. This is the utility that you will use to start and stop and modify specific RAC components in 11G R2 environment. We will look at RAC performance. This would be diagnosing issues such as AWR, ADDM, and look at the GV tables. We will look at cluster interconnects as well as the single client access name. We will add nodes. We will start with a single instance RAC, and we will expand this and we'll add another node to that single instance. So we're going to push out the cluster software as well as the database software and add an additional database instance. We will reduce the RAC components, which basically is removing a node from RAC. And then again, we'll talk about diagnosing RAC issues. With this, we're going to be using the utility CRS-CTL. Server control is a utility that you're going to use to start and stop RAC components. CRS-CTL would be a utility that you can use to start and stop the cluster components, as well as get information about their availability. Then we will look at the RAC parameter files. These would be the SP files. We will look at the initialization parameters. For example, cluster database is equal to true. So we'll look at the parameters that have to be unique and those ones that can be different. We look at RAC and high availability. This is part of Oracle's HAA, which is High Availability Architecture. So in a RAC environment, we have duplication of instances, but we also take a look at duplication of databases, which would talk about RAC and DataGuard. RAC in and of itself will protect in the event of an instance failure, but DataGuard is going to protect in the event of a database failure. We're going to learn how to configure RAC with DataGuard, as well as DataGuard and Data Broker. Data Broker is the component of DataGuard that enables automatic failover. You can have DataGuard and not have DataGuard Broker, which means in the event that a specific data center fails, you would have to manually fail over to a surviving data center. So again, if that data center, if your primary data center was in Atlanta and your secondary database was in, or data center was in Chicago, you'd have to perform a manual failover. With DataGuard Broker, if your primary was in Atlanta and your secondary was in Chicago and Atlanta data center goes south, DataGuard Broker will automatically fail you over to the data center in Chicago. And then we will look at RAC and ASM. RAC is real application clusters and ASM is automatic storage management. This is Oracle's new way of storing data, which was actually introduced back in version 10. In this course, ASM will also be referred to as grid infrastructure. Oracle introduced the grid infrastructure architecture in Oracle 11g R2, and we'll see how that works specifically within the RAC environment. Also, how do you patch RAC? We will look at rolling patches and RAC-specific patches. And then finally, how to configure RAC in a virtualized environment, either using Oracle's VirtualBox or VM Player or VM Server. We'll look at specifically how to configure VM and why you'll use VMware with a RAC environment. We'll specifically see what Oracle versions or Oracle editions you can use RAC with. Obviously, RAC will be used with Enterprise Edition, but also the Standard Edition of Oracle comes with a 2-node RAC. So if you want to use Oracle's Enterprise Edition and then what I would refer to as RACify it, you have to pay Oracle an additional licensing fee. If you want to have just a 2-node RAC, you could purchase Oracle Standard Edition and it will come with a 2-node RAC without having additional licensing. We will look at node management, which has to do with adding and removing nodes within the RAC environment, and then specifically removing the cluster software from a node within RAC. We'll talk about RAC and real applications. This would be things like TAF, which is Transparent Application Failover. So in the event that you connect to a specific instance in the RAC environment, and in the middle of that connection, that specific instance goes away or aborts, the RAC environment will automatically fail you over to a surviving instance, and this was totally transparent to your end users. And then we will have demos of all of the exercises as well. The specific path for this course will be Oracle 10 and 11g Database Administration 1, Part 1 and 2, as well as Oracle Database Administration 2, Part 1 and 2, and then finally Oracle 11g R2 RAC Part 1. And then this course, which is Oracle 11g R2 RAC Part 2. The materials to download for this course will be the student guide as well as the exercise guide. And then finally you will have the lab setup guide. Okay, let's get started.